Okay, so we're going to start the respiratory system. Now, a couple of things. What's the goal of this system?
Breathe.
Okay, so I figured you were going to say that.
Exhale carbon dioxide.
All right, here's the thing. There's two things going on here. One is breathing, and the other one is gas exchange. So those are not the same thing. Okay? The gas exchange system is basically this. It's bringing in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide. That's not the same as breathing. Breathing is the movement of air. Gas exchange is diffusion. Now, did you guys study diffusion? Okay. I'll show you what I mean by that. So here's a hydra. Remember this picture? Does it breathe? It does. Does a hydra breathe? No, it doesn't. What a hydra does is it exchanges gases with the environment. So basically, oxygen goes in and carbon dioxide goes up. That's what's known as gas exchange. And that only happens by diffusion. Did you remember what diffusion is? It's when things move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So the only way oxygen gets into your body is if you're in an environment where there's a lot of oxygen. If you're in an environment where there is no oxygen, then you can breathe all you want, but you're not going to get any oxygen in because there's no oxygen to diffuse into your body. So gas exchange is diffusion. Don't confuse that with, so it's diffusion. Don't confuse that with breathing. Breathing is different. And we'll talk about breathing and how it works. Okay? Not all organisms breathe. Does this earthworm breathe? No. But it doesn't, so here's the thing. All organisms exchange gas. Not pass gas, exchange gas. But not all organisms breathe. Yep. No. An earthworm doesn't breathe. So how does an earthworm get oxygen without breathing? Well, basically, it lives in an environment where there's a lot of oxygen. The oxygen diffuses in, and the carbon dioxide diffuses out. So, here's the thing about earthworms. I didn't know this, but you know when it rains they come out? I always thought because if they're in the ground and it rains, they'll drown. It turns out that's not why they come out. It's because they come out because the outside is moist and they can come out when it's moist. When it's dry outside, they can't. You ever see what happens when it rains and then they get stuck on the surface and then they just bake, they roast, they die? Here's an important thing. Whatever you're exchanging gas with, so whatever you're using to exchange gas with the environment, for an earthworm, it's the skin. For us, it's our lungs. But whatever we're using, it has to remain, and this is a very important concept, it has to remain wet. Has to remain wet. So an earthworm has to remain wet. And for us, it's not a problem because our lungs are inside, so they're always wet. But for an earthworm, because when it rains outside, they can come out because it's wet outside, so they can stay nice and moist. So gas exchange is not the same as diffusion. Okay? Gas exchange is not the same as breathing. Okay? Not the same as breathing. So we're going to focus on breathing and gas exchange in air. But I will mention a little bit about water in a minute here because we know that life started where? In the water. So first organisms were exchanging gas with water. So there is gas in water. You know that because when you see water and it starts to heat up, you see bubbles. So there is gas in water, and gas will diffuse into things like fish, and gas will diffuse out of fish through these organs. What are these? These are gills. Now, they have to remain moist. So for fish, it's not a problem unless the fish is where? Out of the water.
Is that a gill in a fish, or is it outside the fish?
This is a gill. Now, gills are external. So you can see the gills from the outside of the body, right? That's why a fish has to remain in water. You take the fish out of water, eventually it'll die because those gills will dry out. And then the membranes don't work if they're dry. They have to remain wet for them to work. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between breathing and gas exchange. So let's talk about breathing, okay? Breathing is the movement of a fluid. You can also call it as ventilation. It's the movement of a fluid in and out. Now, we'll talk about how we do it. Yesterday, you were working on a lab, and you were noticing that the fish would open its mouth and close its mouth. And then at the same time, what happens is the mouth opens, water rushes in, mouth closes, and then the gills open, and then what happens is the water gets forced over the gills. Breathing and ventilation is the movement of a fluid, okay? Now, how do we breathe? Does anyone know how we breathe?
No. It goes into our lungs. The little branches of our lungs.
But how does it work?
It goes into the
No, I know, but how does it work? So you guys in grade 10 probably studied the systems, and you probably studied this system, right? And you did parts. So we kind of know the way air flows. So for fish, it's basically the movement across the gills. These things. And these are analogous to lungs. They do the same thing. So, in grade 10, you probably studied the parts, so you know that air goes from the nasal cavity to the pharynx, and then instead of going into the esophagus, it goes into the trachea. Well, sometimes you get air in your esophagus, right? And then it goes into these branches, and then eventually ends up at these things called what? Alveoli. And one of the questions on your exam could be comparing alveoli with villi. That could be an example of a combo question because they do something very similar. Remember what villi do? They're folded. They kind of have a bubbly appearance, right? And they're thin, and they're full of blood vessels. And if you look at the alveoli, they're bubbly, they're thin, and they're full of blood vessels because they do something very similar. Villi allow for the diffusion and movement of what? Nutrients. Alveoli allow for the diffusion of what? Gas, in and out. Oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. So let's talk about how this works. Let's talk about breathing mechanics. Okay? So I think this is the animation. Yeah. Breathing mechanics. So breathing mechanics, remember, breathing and gas exchange are not the same thing, okay? Do all organisms need to breathe? No. Do all organisms need to exchange gas? By the way, why do they need to exchange gas? Why do we need the oxygen? Okay, I'll come back to that. Because I'm assuming that you guys remember. Maybe you don't. So here is how we breathe. This is a picture of the lungs. Actually, it's an animation. All right. So here are the parts. Okay. So you can see the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the lungs, and then there's this very special organ, muscle, actually called a diaphragm. Okay. Now, if you took chemistry, you may have remembered there is a relationship between pressure and volume. Okay? So the idea is when the volume increases, so right now the volume is, you can see it's a particular value, and then as the volume increases, the pressure goes down. Right? You can see that again. So this box has a volume. and you can see here's the pressure. Don't worry about the units. Make the volume bigger, the pressure goes down. Here's the thing about fluids. Fluids move always towards lower pressure. Away from high pressure towards lower pressure. That's the way a vacuum cleaner works. A vacuum cleaner generates low pressure, so air rushes in. That's how a tornado works. A tornado generates low pressure, and it sucks in stuff. Okay? So the way you breathe is by simply increasing the volume. Now watch. Watch what happens when I think they're over there.
Do you still need a image? I finished the mole, but I can
the what?
get
Sorry?
some more. You know when you asked me
Not today, we're not doing it today.
Not today?
No, tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the volume of, this is the thoracic cavity, okay? These are where your lungs are. Now, you'll notice the volume will increase and decrease, will increase and decrease. Here's the thing. When the volume increases, the pressure is going to go down. So when you inhale, this muscle contracts and increases the space here. So as this goes up, the pressure goes down, and air always goes towards low pressure. So the reason why your lungs get bigger is because you're generating low pressure, and the air goes in. Students often have it the other way around. They think that the lungs get bigger because air goes in and it forces the lungs to expand. That's not what's happening. The cavity increases in size. The volume increases. That generates low pressure, and then the air goes in. It's actually the other way around, right? So when you exhale, it's just the opposite. You make the volume smaller. What that will do is that will increase the pressure, and then you breathe and you exhale. Air comes out. Yep. Well, there's also red muscles that are also involved, but the diaphragm is, for me, the star of the show. So as it pulls down, you can see, sorry. Okay. As it pulls down, the volume increases and the pressure goes down, air comes in. Air always goes, that's just a rule. Air goes to low pressure. And when you exhale, diaphragm relaxes, the volume decreases, pressure goes up, air goes out. Very simple rule. So breathing mechanics, this is how we move air in and out. But here's the thing. If you are an earthworm, earthworms don't do this. They don't need to do this. Now remember we talked about not all organisms need a system, because if you're small enough, you might not need it. So earthworms don't breathe. They exchange gas with their environment, just like a hydra does, but it doesn't breathe. It doesn't force air in, it doesn't force air out. Okay. So this is how we breathe. I'm jumping around a little bit differently today. Where is my graph? I don't know. I'm missing stuff on this PowerPoint.
Everybody's at like 3 p.m. we have to wrap up. We died at 7 o'clock. And I think this is the restaurant. It's $1 on them.
Okay, I'm missing a graph in this part. Okay, I'm going to close this and reopen it. Something's wrong with it.
We're going to do one of our water. Hey, mine's still alive, right? You want my water?
Okay, here it is. Hey, ladies. All right. For some reason, some of the slides weren't coming up. So, we okay with how we breathe? Okay. So, inhalation, you can see the cavity increases in size, and when you exhale, it decreases in size. That changes the pressure. This is a graph that shows you the amount of air in your lungs. So you'll notice that when you breathe, okay, so here you, regular breath, inhalation, regular breath, exhalation, right? When you take a deep breath, you can get a lot more air in your lungs. And when you ever get, like, you try to force all of the air out of your lungs, this would be when you force all of the air out of your lungs. But here's the thing. Even if you try to force all of the air out of your lungs, there's always going to be a little bit left.
Why?
I was waiting for that. Why? It's a good question. Well, let's go back to this picture here. What does that look like to you? It looks like a bubble, right? So there's pressure in this bubble. What would happen if we took all of the air out? What happens to a balloon if you take all the air out? Deflate. Totally deflate. Okay. What's the problem with that? How many of you have ever had the wind knocked out of you in a sport? How does it feel?
Horrible.
Describe the feeling.
My dresser. Like I was like, it was like the air literally sucked out of me.
Right. So,
Yeah. You think you're dying and your dad's like, you're fine. Stop running.
based on the idea of how we breathe, how do you explain what happened then? You got hit really hard, right?
I got a slap shot in the stomach.
Okay.
I
So, you get hit really hard in the chest. That generates very, very high pressure. That forces the air out. Because the air is going to want to move from high pressure to low pressure. In this case, low pressure is out of your body. The reason why it's hard to breathe is, think about what's going on in this graph. In this graph, we're seeing that there's always going to be a little bit of air left behind. The reason why there's air left behind is because if you look at the shape of the alveoli, they're like little bubbles. If you take all of the air out of the alveoli, they collapse. The problem is when they collapse, they're sticky. And they're very hard to open up again. And if the alveoli don't open up, you ain't going to be breathing. You're going to have a hard time getting in oxygen. So, yeah, it's horrible. It's happened to me. It's an awful feeling.
So what's wrong with the lungs when you have asthma?
That's different. We'll talk about that later. So, if you have like a collapsed lung, you ever heard of a collapsed lung? This is where the lung cannot inflate properly. Because you can see that there's always going to be a little bit of air left behind in the lungs so that they stay somewhat inflated. Now, one of the questions on your exam is to compare the way we breathe to the way birds breathe. I want to show you a picture of birds. So here's a bird. Okay? Now, the way it breathes is the same way. It generates low pressure inside, air goes in. Generates high pressure inside, air goes out. Very simple idea. But there's a huge difference in what they do. If you look at the way the air flows in a bird, it's actually set up a little bit differently than it is in humans. In humans, and most other animals, the air goes in, and it comes back out the exact same route. If you look at your diagram of your respiratory system, the air starts here, goes down into the lungs when you inhale, but then eventually goes back out the exact same route that it came in. When you look at a bird, though, in a bird, it's actually a cycle or a circle. So it starts off here, and it goes back here, here, in a circle, and then out. It doesn't go one way and then reverse out the other way. It actually cycles. Now, what's actually happening is you can see here is a bird inhaling. So in blue, that represents one cycle of breathing. So the air on inhalation goes into the back, not even into the lungs, into these sacs. Then when the bird exhales, the air is forced into the lungs. On the second breath, the air that was in the lungs goes into the anterior sacs. And then when the bird exhales the second time, that air gets forced out. So it's not like us where we inhale and then exhale. Them, it's a whole cycle. Why? What's the point? Why don't they just do what we do? Why do they do this? What's that? It has to do with flight. Yeah. So I made an assumption that you guys know why we need to breathe and why we need to exchange gas. What's the purpose of this? Why do we need the oxygen? Yeah, what's that? Here, very simple. This is not the equation though. Food plus oxygen gives you energy, not photosynthesis, plus carbon dioxide. So we need the oxygen to make energy. Okay? Now, flying requires more energy, which means they need more oxygen. The whole reason why they're doing this is to deliver more oxygen to their body. If you think about the problem with us, when we look at this graph, you'll notice that some of the air stays in your lungs. And it just sits there for a while. And it's old air that does not have a lot of oxygen in it. I call it stale air, or not fresh air. So for us it's fine, but for a bird needs more oxygen because flying is more expensive. So they had to figure out a way around this problem. They had to evolve a strategy. And their strategy is to cycle the air using those sacs. That will deliver more oxygen because there's no stale air sitting there. Again, remember, for us, it has to sit there because if it gets totally eliminated, our lungs will collapse. So, in biology, nothing comes free. This is a much better system. What do you think the cost is, though? What's the cost? Even this is a better system. There's a cost to it. Yep. More space. And guess what system was reduced in size to make up for the space required? Very good. Excellent. Digestive system. So when you look at a bird, its digestive system is a bit smaller, but its respiratory system is a bit bigger. Okay? But they need that. All right. Now, so breathing. Are we okay with what breathing is?
Yes.
Okay. So what then is gas exchange?
It's when you don't breathe.
No. Gas exchange is just diffusion. It's the movement of gases from high concentration to low concentration. So, in this diagram here, this is a picture of your lungs. Okay, so here are your lungs. This is your alveoli. And these are the cells in your body, okay? The red represents oxygen, and the blue represents the carbon dioxide. So when we talk about gas exchange, we mean oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. And that's only driven by diffusion. Okay, it's not breathing, it's diffusion. So, do you understand how diffusion works?
Yes.
Okay, so let me draw you a picture. Let me put up a membrane. And let me ask you, which way will the red dots move? Left to right or right to left? Left to right. Why? Very good. Because we have a high concentration here, and we have a low concentration there. Does that make sense? Okay. So whether you're a fish or a land animal, the way you get oxygen in is by diffusion. That's the way you get it in. Okay? So, how you breathe, we talked about how we breathe. Now, fish, same idea. It's by generating a pressure gradient. So they move water. They're not moving air, they're moving water. Here's the question. What do you think is harder? Yeah. I mean, think about a balloon. You guys have played with water balloons, right? Think about a balloon full of air and how easy it is to move. Think about a balloon of water and how hard it is to move. So who has a harder time? Us breathing air and moving air by generating pressure gradient, or a fish? Fish. It's much harder breathing in water than it is breathing in air. It's very difficult. And we got another problem. There's way more oxygen in air than there is in water. So fish have a major disadvantage. It's harder to move water, and it's harder to get the oxygen because there's not a lot of oxygen in water. So how do they compensate? How do they compensate for having this problem where it's really hard to move the water and there's not a lot of oxygen in the water? What do they do? So I'm going to show you their solution. See if you can figure out the answer, okay? So a lot of fish do something like this. Sorry, like this. This is called a countercurrent system. This will be the last thing I explain to you, okay? In a countercurrent system, the blood flows in the opposite direction that the fish moves or the oxygen moves or the water moves. Let's give you an example. Let's say, imagine we had a vessel. I'm going to actually put up a new slide. Okay. Draw you a little picture here. And I use, yeah. So let me show you this. Imagine we have a blood vessel. So here's blood. And here is water. Okay? Imagine the blood starts off with 0% oxygen, and the water starts off with 100% oxygen. What's the best we could hope for that the blood will pick up? Very good. Why 50? Yeah, because if this is 50%, then that 50% would have come from the water, right? And the best diffusion can do is balance things out. But I want you to think of reversing that now, okay? Let's move the blood the other way. Let's move the blood the opposite direction of the water. So here comes the water. It starts off with 100%, and the oxygen starts off with 0%. What's the best we can do now? Very close to 100. Why? Because even when you get to that 50% value, what do you notice? You're always facing water that has more oxygen. This is called the countercurrent system. So what fish have evolved, and most of them do this, is this solution around it's really hard to move water. There's not a lot of oxygen in the water. They develop what's called a countercurrent system, which allows them to bring in almost, not quite 100%, but you can see at least 90% of the available oxygen. So it's way more than 50. Okay? So we talked about, I'm going to end here. We talked about the difference in breathing and gas exchange. And then we looked at how breathing works, breathing mechanics. And we looked at some adaptations in birds and in fish. And we'll end there. Okay, ladies? That's it.
The end.